Germany is extending its coronavirus lockdown until April 18th as it grapples with a third wave of the pandemic. The move comes after talks between Chancellor Angela Merkel and regional leaders ran into the early hours of the morning. Leaders were at loggerheads over whether to ease restrictions on domestic travel over the Easter holiday season, ultimately agreeing on a 5-day strict national shutdown over the period. Merkel says the coronavirus crisis in Germany has taken a dangerous turn.
We basically have a new pandemic. The mutation from Great Britain has taken over, which means we have a new virus. Of course, of the same kind, but with very different properties. It is clearly more lethal, more contagious, and contagious for longer.
Our correspondent Thomas Sparrow is covering this story for us. Thomas, Germany is tightening restrictions in the face of what Chancellor Angela Merkel is calling a new pandemic. What are we looking at here?
Terry, that's a remarkable statement by the German Chancellor after hours of discussion with regional leaders, after a very controversial meeting in the German Chancellery behind me, which included several hours where they weren't meeting, where there was a division, let's say, in that sense. So it just gives you an idea of how difficult the situation has become when it comes to the coronavirus numbers, to that exponential rise in infections. It also gives you an idea of just how controversial the whole situation is, how difficult it is for leaders to find consensus. By the way, there's also difficulty to find consensus in German society if you look exactly at some of the polls that have come out in recent days. If you ask specifically what was decided, you can divide it in certain aspects. One is the extension of some of the restrictions that are already in place until mid-April. That includes, for example, cultural or sport venues remaining closed. Second, pulling that handbrake, as it's been described here. In other words, those areas that are particularly affected will have to reverse some of the opening steps that had been decided a few weeks ago. And third, you already mentioned it as well, that particular lockdown over Easter, which, by the way, Terry, was one of the main reasons why regional and federal leaders could not agree yesterday, and why these discussions went actually well into the night, and why we're now discussing this early in the morning after those very, very long talks.
Are these measures, Thomas, likely to be enough to really stem the country's third wave of infections? Isn't it too little, too late yet again?
Well, certainly there's a sense of frustration among the German population. There's a sort of uncertainty, especially by those who do not see a light at the end of the tunnel. But if you ask those who were meeting yesterday at the German Chancellery, they certainly believe that this can help to reduce numbers, in particular when we talk about that lockdown over Easter. But there is a lot of criticism as well. And again, if you look at some of the polls that have come out in recent days before the announcement yesterday, you will see that people are divided as to what should be the course of action for Germany, especially if you consider, on the one hand, those high infection numbers, but on the other hand, the fact that Germany is going through a very slow vaccination process, which, by the way, was described as the way out of the pandemic. So there is, on the one hand, hope that vaccinations will help, but there's also frustration by the way that it's all going here in Germany.
Thomas, thank you very much. That was our political correspondent, Thomas Sparrow. Well, for even more, we're joined now by Michael Theurer. He's the deputy leader of the opposition Free Democrats in Germany's parliament, the Bundestag, and party leader in the state of Baden-Württemberg. Thanks for being with us this morning, Mr. Theurer. Now, you've previously criticized the government's coronavirus strategy. What do you make of these latest measures?
Yeah, good morning, first of all. The latest measures, they took a really long time to be approved by the minister presidents and the chancellery. We think it has both positive outcomes and negative outcomes. What we are in favor is a German-wide standard, which is implemented regionally. That is mainly guaranteed now, but we don't have a convincing answer on the biggest issues, that is the test capacity, which is still too low, and the whole process of testing is too slow. And the second is that the vaccination process which was mentioned by your reporter, is not yet with the same speed implemented like we can see in the United Kingdom or in the United States of America.
I want to ask you about that in just a moment, the vaccination rollout, which is very controversial. But first, about these measures that have just been decided, do you think that the German government really had any alternative at this point?
Yes, they have, and they should have implemented this plan of step-by-step opening or closing a bit earlier. So what is not convincing anybody is that there are
restrictions on traveling, because if we look at the infections in hotels or even in restaurants, there is the Robert Koch Institute tells us that there is not a major risk there, and therefore we are completely in favor of a strategy which is more to the target and which will not end up in a general lockdown.
Your party has championed a plan to gradually reopen the economy. You just talked about restaurants and maybe things should have been done earlier. But is it realistic to open the economy given the risks to public health?
We see both the risks, but we also have to have an opportunity and a perspective for the traders, for the retailers, and especially for hotels and restaurants in areas, in counties where the incidence rate is still low. And we have model regions like the university town of Tübingen, where there is a testing strategy rolled out, which is leading to a significantly lower incidence rate. And we do not understand why the German health minister Jens Spahn and the Chancellor Angela Merkel did not help to roll out this successful strategy of Tübingen to all over the place in Germany.
Mr. Theurer, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Michael Theurer from the Free Democrats, member of the German Bundestag.